So you're a speed skater. Not the end of the world, but remember, we're trying to run. This is going to be a landmine of little reels that I'm going to chop up later on. So if you don't like the long stuff, bear with me and I'll see you later. If you like the details, this is for you. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, this refers to last post. You're missing that hip extension, which is causing you to go wide and you're speed skating, and we're trying to go forward. That was the quick and dirty. So we're going to go over the steps of first, how to gain it, and then how do we retrain that newfound range of motion and not resort back to that faulty pattern. So there's a sequence. Just like with going after ankle range of motion, there's kind of a step-by-step process, and as long as you can justify what you're doing or the order that you're doing it, who's anybody to say anything different? This is what I typically like to do. In order to gain hip extension range of motion, what can cause that is a lack of extensibility of the hip capsule. It can be of the muscles of the hip flexors, and this is how I like to go over it, go after it. First, muscle knot. Small little trigger point, little contraction in the muscle fiber that won't let go. You can't just stretch it out. Think of that knot like a rope. You've got a knot. In order to release that, we're going to do a trigger point release where we're going to take a ball, or in the example, a wooden spoon, and you're going to apply deep, sustained pressure. Not kneading dough, applying deep pressure. That's important. Second, we're going to go over dynamic stretching, so more of the mobilization with movements. That's for reps, that's not as much hold. That's more to go over or to go after the joint capsule. Think of a joint like two bones that come together, and there's saran wrap all around it to help keep it in place. That can become restricted, so we're going to go after more so the joint capsule in that situation. And then you're all familiar with the static stretching, 30-second hold, 10-second recovery, 3 rounds of that. So I'm going to go over it, and that's for the muscle. So first, for the muscles, there's 3 muscles that we're going to talk about that can limit your hip extension. They're hip flexors, so when they're limited, they can cause a lack of hip extension. So we talked last post, your body's going to find a way to move forward or to make up for this. Rotate or use a different plane. The 3 muscles that make up your hip flexors are your psoas, starts with a P, crazy, isn't it? Psoas major is the full term. Iliacus is that number 2, and those 2 have different origins and they have the same insertion. So we kind of combine them when it gets lower towards the insertion and call it your iliopsoas. That's important later on because we differentiate these when it comes to the trigger point release. We do not when it comes to the static stretching. And then third, the rectus femoris. That's the one of the 4 quadricep muscles that does cross the hip and the knee, so it affects both of them. So you'll see why a lot of times that's involved and we don't get it unless you tweak something, and you'll see why. So the first one, everything we're gonna do, trigger point release of all 3 of the muscles. First, you're going to have to become familiar with this ASIS, anterior superior iliac spine. It's that bony hip pointer on the front of your pelvis. You've got one on each side. That's a very important landmark because we're going to need it when we're finding both psoas and iliacus. Once you find that, when it comes to the psoas, you're also going to find your belly button. If you imagine and draw a line between those 2 spots, that's where you're going to find your psoas muscle. So here I'm using a wooden spoon. I'm using the blunt part, or it's the sharper of the 2, but you know what I mean. Don't impale yourself here. I can't be responsible for that. And so what you're going to do is now once you find that halfway point, notice how I'm angling it in towards the spine, towards midline. If I go straight down, I'm going to miss it. I'm verifying that I'm on that muscle by flexing my hip or activating it. So you saw I lifted my foot off, flexed my hip, muscle popped off, I'm in the right spot. By applying that deep pressure, I'm therapeutic. I'm making it more effective by then dropping the knee in and out. That's the first one. Next, trigger point release of the second in line, the iliacus. Go back to that same bony prominence we did before, but notice how it's shaped more like a bowl. So whereas before we were aiming more towards midline for the psoas, now we're aiming more away from midline for the iliacus. I like to think of the tip of that bone, the hip pointer, like a mountain. We're trying to kind of scrape, imagine like there's snow on the mountain. We're trying to scrape that snow down off that mountain. we're kind of abutting against it. If you got it right and it needs it, it is tender. And this one can help tremendously, not just improving hip extension, but also hip flexion. Notice here, I did turn it around. I'm using more of the spoon part of the wooden spoon. You can, if you like punishing yourself, get a little more aggressive and turn it around and use the sharper side. Same rules apply. Find an ASIS, angling in and out. And again, bent knee, fall out. So next, to finish off the third for the trigger point release for the knots, it's going to be the rectus femoris. So I like to do this in sitting, and you'll see why. When I'm finding the spot, I find the tip of my kneecap, and I go right in the middle, and I follow it straight up. You can't go wrong. Notice what I'm doing. I'm not actively extending my leg. I'm not using the muscle. I'm passively taking it where my other leg is taking it through that excursion. That is important because that's what's going to help to release it when the muscle is off and passive. So up next is our dynamic. Just one dynamic movement just for the hip capsule. You've only got one capsule, 3 before, only 1. So what you're going to see is this looks familiar, and it is the same position as our hip flexor stretch. But notice what I do here. I am both keeping my chest upright. If I don't do that, we tend to lean forward and we lose that ability to extend the hip. We're not going to get the stretch. This hand is on my sternum, keeping it upright. This hand is on the top of my hip or the bottom of my back. And I'm kind of pinning myself. That stays vertical and I'm translating forward. Some other key points is I'm taking this hand and I'm pushing forward to help to mobilize. And notice how my foot isn't too close underneath me. I'd run out of real estate. I have it a little bit further. So this is more for reps, repetition. We very quickly and very easily turn that into the final piece, the static stretch, is where now we're just going to hold this 30 seconds. I do recommend about 10 seconds getting out of the position, let some blood come back to the muscle, and then going into it again. But again, holding that same position and trying to get that stretch up towards the front of your hip. So now we're going to use a bell, a dog leash. We're going to do everything the same. Tuck the pelvis, up tall, foot in front. Now I'm starting with some knee flexion. So now you'll see the stretch is going to be lower. You're going to feel a little bit lower than you did before because now we're getting that rectus femoris. So again, this is static. We're just holding 30 seconds. We're not doing this dynamically. So now that you've gained it, we've got to retrain it. Your body doesn't necessarily know we have this new range of motion. We have to use it and not fall back into those old patterns. So to retrain it, here's what we're going to do. 2 things. Working on the push and the pull. What you're going to do is you're going to go on your stomach. This hand is monitoring that ASIS that we talked about before, that hip pointer. I want to make sure when I'm lifting, one, I'm not arching my back. That's kind of assumed. But this is the important part. Notice what we did when we cheated with the test is we opened up our hip. If I feel at the top of that, I want to make sure I can extend the hip without that happening, keeping contact with my hand the whole time. If I fail, here's the fail. This is the compensation. I'm lifting, I'm rotating my body to open up the hip, and that's coming up. We don't want to do that. That's what's leading to that wide running stance. Stay on the road, which is leading to the medial knee pain. So there, I'm monitoring, and that is a fail. So if you still can't do it, that means you still have to gain it. You still have to work on the range of motion. That's why mobility comes first before retraining it, or neuromuscular re-ed we call it. And so the final piece after this is we're going to go back to the tried and true running man. This is what we were doing before, which is incorrect. Notice how my knees are going towards the same side elbow. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use this as a point of reference. I'm practicing driving straight forward, straight forward, straight forward, not going around and not going across. And I've had trouble uploading some of these exercises before, but if you click on the link in my bio and click on, I think it says gain it, train it. It's a second link on there. I have all these exercises that I just showed you guys with a little bit more detail written out. So you'll have a reference, and hopefully you can download it, screenshot, whatever. Coming up next is our next running form fault, the puppet. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Dr. Matt Minard, and I'm so passionate about helping you run safer. If you found this video helpful, if you could please subscribe and share it with your friends, I'd be forever grateful. I have shorter form content on my Instagram, Learn to Run, and then the longer stuff here, more lecture based, because I understand we come to different platforms for different reasons. So follow me over on Instagram if you want the short and sweet, and follow me on here if you want the longer breakdowns.